The village lay hidden deep in the eastern reaches of Europe, a forgotten place where winter seemed permanent and the sun rarely stayed long enough to offer warmth. Snow pressed heavily against crooked wooden houses, sealing doors and memories alike, while narrow roads vanished beneath layers of ice no one bothered to clear. Smoke rose silently from chimneys, but there was no sense of life, only routine survival. Every building looked as though it had been standing too long, watching too much, carrying histories no one dared to pass down. Outsiders were almost never seen here, and when they were, the village seemed to shrink inward, as if the land itself rejected unfamiliar footsteps. In this place, secrets were not hidden, they were preserved, frozen in time, waiting patiently for someone foolish enough to uncover them. I arrived as an investigative journalist, officially sent to document a string of unresolved disappearances that had quietly accumulated over the past 30 years. On paper, the cases were scattered and unrelated: missing hikers, runaway children, seasonal workers who never returned home. But the patterns were impossible to ignore once I looked closer. The same months, the same forest paths, the same final sightings near the village borders. The authorities had long since stopped asking questions, labeling each case as misadventure or voluntary disappearance. To me, it felt less like negligence and more like deliberate exhaustion, as if everyone involved had learned that digging deeper only led to consequences no report could justify. From the moment I stepped into the village square, I felt the weight of being watched without ever seeing anyone stare. Conversations died the instant I passed, doors closed too quickly, and curtains shifted just enough to remind me I was not welcome. When I asked simple questions, about the weather, the roads, the forest, the villagers' expressions tightened with quiet panic. Some crossed themselves, others whispered prayers under their breath, and a few simply walked away as if they hadn't heard me at all. The name of the forest was never spoken aloud. When it slipped from my mouth, an old man dropped his basket and fled. It was clear then that fear here was not sudden or irrational. It was learned, practiced, and deeply ingrained, passed down like an unspoken law. At the very edge of the forest stood the orphanage, or what remained of it, a massive stone structure blackened by soot and age, its windows hollow like empty eye sockets. Official records claimed it had been abandoned after a tragic fire 40 years ago, deemed unsafe and left to rot. Yet the building looked less like a ruin and more like something deliberately preserved, untouched by scavengers or nature. Iron gates still hung from their hinges, creaking softly even when there was no wind, and the ground around it was strangely free of snow, as if the earth itself rejected covering it. Locals refused to point in its direction, and when I tried to photograph it, my camera malfunctioned repeatedly, each image blurring into a dark smear. Standing there, I felt an overwhelming sense that the orphanage was not empty, it was merely waiting. That first night, sleep came only in fragments. The cold crept through the walls of the guest house, and the silence felt unnatural, too deliberate to be comforting. Sometime after midnight, a sound cut through it, long, distant, and strained, like a scream dragged across the frozen air. It echoed from the direction of the forest, rising and falling as if carried deliberately by the wind. I sat up, listening, my heart pounding, waiting for it to end. But it didn't come just once. It returned again and again, sometimes closer, sometimes faint, always unmistakably human. By morning, when I asked the innkeeper if anyone else had heard it, she stared at me with hollow eyes and said quietly, "No one hears anything at night here, if they want to live." The next day, I searched through old municipal archives stored in a damp, windowless room beneath the town hall. Dust-covered folders revealed police reports dating back decades, each documenting a missing child from the village or nearby settlements. The details were disturbingly repetitive. Last seen walking home, last heard screaming near the forest, last reported after sunset. Investigations were always brief, conclusions vague, and cases quietly closed within days. No bodies were ever recovered, no suspects named. What unsettled me most was a handwritten note stamped on several files in fading red ink: "Search terminated by order." There was no signature, no explanation, only the clear implication that someone or something had decided the children were never meant to be found. My first real break came from a woman the villagers avoided, a retired nurse who lived alone at the far end of the settlement, her house sagging as if it were slowly collapsing under its own memories. She agreed to speak only after locking every door and covering the windows with thick cloth. In a trembling voice, she admitted she had once worked at the orphanage before the fire, tending to children no one ever came to claim. What the outside world called discipline, she said, was something far darker. Punishments designed to break fear into obedience, carried out in the name of correction. She stopped speaking suddenly, her eyes filling with tears, and whispered that some children didn't die in the fire. They were taken below, where screams were not considered disobedience but progress. Guided by the nurse's directions, I returned to the orphanage just before dusk, when the forest seemed to lean inward and the air grew unnaturally still. Inside the main hall, beneath a collapsed staircase, I found a metal hatch half buried under ash and debris, its edges eaten away by rust. It took all my strength to pry it open, releasing a breath of cold air that smelled of damp stone and something older, stagnant, organic. A narrow stairway descended into darkness, the steps worn smooth as if countless feet had passed over them long after the orphanage was supposedly abandoned. At the bottom, I saw iron rings bolted into the walls and thick chains coiled on the floor, sealed behind heavy doors that looked less like barriers and more like attempts to keep something from coming back up. As I moved deeper into the tunnels, my flashlight revealed walls covered in uneven scratches, layered so thickly they looked like wood grain carved into stone. Some marks were shallow and frantic, others slow and deliberate, as if made after hope had already faded. Between them were words, names, dates, pleas, written with whatever the children had been able to use, charcoal, ash, and dark dried stains that time had not fully erased. One message appeared again and again along the corridor, etched so deeply it split the stone: "We learned." Standing there, surrounded by the remnants of their desperation, I understood that these tunnels were not merely places of confinement, they were classrooms where suffering was repeated until it became obedience. That night, the tunnels followed me into my sleep. I dreamed of children standing in perfect rows, their faces pale and rigid, skin marked by burns that glowed faintly in the dark. Their eyes were empty, not pleading, not angry, only expectant, as if waiting for instructions. They never spoke, yet I understood them clearly, their silence pressing against my thoughts like a command. When I woke, my heart was racing and my sheets were damp with sweat, but the room was unbearably cold. For a brief moment, I was certain I heard soft footsteps circling my bed, stopping just close enough for me to feel watched, evaluated, as though the lesson had begun and I was the one being studied. When morning came, I noticed thin red lines running along my forearms, shallow but precise, as if traced carefully rather than inflicted in struggle. They didn't burn or ache, they simply existed, arranged in parallel patterns that made no sense. I searched my memory for any explanation, scratching in my sleep, a fall, anything, but found nothing. As the days passed, more marks appeared, faint bruises around my wrists, impressions on my ankles like hands had held me there for hours. What unsettled me most was not the injuries themselves, but the absence of fear that came with them. Instead, I felt a creeping familiarity, as if my body was beginning to remember rules my mind had never learned. When I confronted the villagers again, the silence finally cracked. An elderly priest, his voice worn thin by years of confession, admitted the truth in fragments, glancing nervously toward the forest as he spoke. Long ago, the village had faced starvation and war, disasters that erased entire generations in nearby towns. Desperate, the elders agreed to an unspoken pact: obedience in exchange for survival. The orphanage became the center of that agreement, a place where children without families were offered up, not killed outright, but reshaped through suffering into guardians of order. They were taught to protect us, the priest whispered, and to punish those who forget why we are still alive. It was then I realized the forest itself was not haunted in the conventional sense. The trees did not hide spirits, they hid witnesses. The children, or what they had become, moved unseen among the trunks, trained to observe, report, and enforce the village's grim rules. They were alive, yet not children anymore. Their innocence had been stripped and replaced with a discipline so precise it bordered on inhuman. The wind that whispered through the branches carried their presence like static on a radio, a subtle signal that someone, or something, was always nearby. Even as I tried to rationalize it, I could not shake the certainty that stepping off the path meant being watched, evaluated, and judged by eyes that no longer belonged to the living. Deeper exploration of the orphanage revealed a hidden chamber beneath what had once been the main hall. Inside, I found shelves lined with old reel-to-reel tapes and broken speakers, dust-covered and warped by time. As I played one of the recordings, the air seemed to thicken around me. The tapes were filled with shrill, unbroken screams, children screaming in fear, pain, and confusion, but not in a random or chaotic way. The sounds were measured, almost rhythmic, interspersed with quiet instructions and hushed tones, teaching the children how to obey terror itself. Listening felt like a violation, like peering into a memory meant to be buried, and I realized the screams had been more than punishment. They were a curriculum, shaping obedience into a weapon that transcended death. Horrifyingly, the realization dawned. The disappearances had never truly stopped, they had only evolved. The children who had vanished decades ago had been transformed into something else, something that walked the line between life and obedience. They were no longer victims in the traditional sense. They had become enforcers of the village's unspoken law. Every whisper of wind, every shadow slipping between the trees, felt like evidence of their presence. I began to notice signs even outside the orphanage. Footprints too small and too deliberate to belong to any adult, sudden chills that traced my spine, and glimpses of figures vanishing when I blinked. The terror wasn't in the past, it was ongoing, patient, and methodical, waiting for the next mistake. That night, as I sat reviewing my notes in the guest house, a small figure appeared in the corner of the room. At first, I thought it was a trick of the shadows, a trick of the flickering candlelight, but then it stepped forward, a child no older than 10, eyes hollow and expressionless. "Finish the lesson," it whispered, its voice both fragile and commanding, sending a chill straight through my chest. I froze, unsure whether to run or speak, but the figure didn't move closer, it simply stood, waiting. The words echoed in my mind long after it disappeared into the darkness. Finish the lesson. I realized then that the village's horrors were not merely historical, they were personal, and now I had been enrolled. Later that night, a low metallic tolling echoed across the village. The bells from the abandoned church, ringing though no one was there to pull the ropes. The sound vibrated through the frozen air, each peal heavier than the last, as if marking the return of some ancient ritual. Windows rattled, doors shivered on their hinges, and even the snow seemed to pause mid-fall. From the forest's edge, shadowy figures emerged, silent and deliberate, moving toward the orphanage in perfect alignment. I could feel the weight of their gaze from a distance, as if they already knew I was there, and the message was unmistakable. The lesson, the cycle, the punishment, it was starting again, and resistance was no longer an option. By the time I reached the orphanage, the villagers had gathered around its perimeter, forming a silent circle that pressed against the snow like a living barrier. Their faces were pale, expressionless, but their eyes held an intensity that was almost unbearable. They began chanting names, children, adults, some I recognized from missing person reports, calling them as if summoning spirits from the forest. The air thickened with a tension that was almost tangible, charged with a force that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. From the darkness beyond, the forest seemed to respond. Branches creaked and faint footsteps whispered closer, revealing shapes that were unmistakably human but not alive in any conventional sense. The boundary between the living and the dead blurred, and I realized the ritual wasn't a prayer, it was an enforcement of obedience, and I was trapped in the center of it. Before I could react, hands, cold, firm, and unyielding, gripped my arms and dragged me toward the orphanage. The villagers made no sound, only moved with a mechanical precision that mirrored the children I had seen in my dreams. Inside, the tunnel stretched farther than I could have imagined, twisting into shadows that seemed to swallow light itself. Every step echoed, not with my own movements, but with faint whispers and sobs that reverberated off the stone walls. I understood, with a sinking certainty, that I was not being taken to witness something horrific. I was being inducted into it. The chains on the walls, the marks in the stone, the screams on the tapes, they were all waiting for someone to continue the cycle, and now that someone was me. In the deepest chamber of the tunnels, the truth was laid bare. The survivors, the ones who had endured the orphanage's punishments decades ago, were still alive but transformed. Their bodies were gaunt, their eyes hollow, and their movements unervingly precise. They were no longer children, yet they were not fully human either. They had been conditioned, trained to perpetuate the horrors they had once suffered. They did not speak, but I understood their purpose instantly, to ensure the cycle continued. Resistance was meaningless. The orphanage, the village, and the forest itself demanded obedience, and those who had learned to survive now enforced the rules on newcomers like me. There was no escape, only participation. A voice, soft yet chillingly authoritative, broke the silence. One of the survivors stepped forward and handed me a small, jagged knife. "Choose," they said, their tone devoid of emotion. "Decide who suffers next." My stomach turned, and the walls seemed to close in, pressing me into a nightmare I could neither deny nor escape. Every instinct screamed to run, yet every fiber of my being knew that to resist was to join the ranks of the missing, another name to be whispered in the village chants. The air felt thick with expectation, as if the shadows themselves were waiting for my answer. I realized then that the orphanage did not merely create victims. It forced complicity, and my choice would seal my fate. I soon understood that the ghosts haunting this place were not vengeful spirits. They were enforcers. They did not seek retribution or justice. They were instruments of the village's law, ensuring that the cycle of punishment and obedience persisted without fail. Every scream I had heard, every mark on the walls, every chilling whisper in the forest was part of a system designed to teach, to control, to perpetuate fear until it became instinct. They moved with purpose, correcting mistakes, punishing hesitation, and guiding the newcomers, like me, into a role I had never asked for. In that moment, I realized the true horror was not the violence itself, but the inescapable inevitability of becoming part of it. The forest, I learned, was the final arbiter. Those who refused to obey, who tried to flee or resist, were taken into the trees, swallowed by shadows so deep that no light could penetrate. I had seen signs of them, footprints that ended abruptly, clothes snagged on branches, distant cries that faded too quickly to trace, but no bodies remained. It was as if the forest itself consumed the defiant, erasing them from existence to maintain the balance of fear and control. And yet, the threat was never abstract. It was immediate, tangible, a presence that pressed against the edge of vision, whispering reminders that the rules were absolute, and any failure carried consequences beyond imagining. When I awoke the next morning, my notebook and camera were gone, replaced by a small, crudely carved figure in the shape of a child. A single note was etched into the wood: "New caretaker appointed." My pulse raced as I realized the truth. My investigation, my life, even my identity had been consumed by the orphanage. The villagers greeted me with polite smiles, but their eyes were empty, knowing, and cold. No one would ask questions, no one would report my disappearance, and no one would stop the cycle. I was no longer an outsider. I had been claimed, inducted into a system that had survived decades by turning terror into tradition, and now I was expected to perpetuate it. Years later, the pattern repeats itself. Another journalist arrives, drawn by whispers of disappearances and old legends, unaware of the history etched into the snow and stone. The villagers greet them with the same silent wariness, the same subtle warnings in their eyes. The orphanage looms at the edge of the forest, seemingly abandoned but watching, waiting. And somewhere in the shadows, the children, now grown, now enforcers, observe, assessing every move, every hesitation. The cycle begins again, patient and unrelenting. The forest holds its breath, the bells toll without hands, and the lesson continues. No one leaves unchanged and no one truly escapes.